All right. Podcast number 2 with Gordon. So Gordon let me know. He was like, "Hey, by the way, February is Heart Health Awareness Month." I thought
Right.
that was cool. So Gordon, tell us a little. You had a good spiel on just like why should we all care about heart health awareness and like our health, our heart health.
A huge question.
I know.
Um, that's a huge question. I'll try to do my best. I mean, it's so to pick that one apart, but just in general, I mean, I think for our audience and for the folks that are, we're in the most contact with in terms of, performance, overall health and well-being, whether it's also in the naturopathic clinic, et cetera. So many reasons to be focused on and looking at your cardiovascular health as well obviously for the many reasons. It's just super important for
Yeah.
long-term health, right? You can't get around it. You have one heart, and you got to take care of it
Yeah.
essentially.
And I think
And
cardiovascular disease, like I would be curious to know, like there's definitely a large percentage of people who die from cardiovascular events.
yeah, I mean, it's one of the largest. It's one of the biggest, essentially, the killers in kind of the West and North America
Yeah.
too. Is so cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular events. So, in all seriousness, that is very important.
Yeah. I
And
saw this fact from the CDC. One person dies every 36 seconds in the United States from cardiovascular disease.
yeah, I think it's number one on the list,
Yeah, it's the
and I
leading
think it has been that way for quite some time. Um, but I think that's just like a high level overarching answer
cause.
to that question. So I'm not sure if I really did it
So
justice,
you
but
you nailed that. But I think too, like we were obviously talking about like, who is the person that's listening to this podcast, right? And it's probably because our following is mostly people who are interested in health and fitness, probably our regular gym goers, whether they're 20 years old, 45, 50 years old, like they are interested in health. And I think that like you made that great point of, people are exercising and they're going to the gym, but are they doing the things for their cardiovascular health? Like, what is the purpose behind the things that they're doing at the gym, right? Are they thinking about their cardiovascular health? Are they just thinking about aesthetics? Are they just wanting to be fit? And, what are they like? How are you using your cardiovascular system, right? And like, is there a purpose behind the exercises that you're doing for it? And is it really benefiting it?
yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think there are a lot of adaptations that happen in from cardiovascular exercise that some people aren't even aware of, and also can contribute to overall cardiovascular health down the road and throughout your, let's say, throughout your training, throughout your program, throughout your just lifestyle, right? So in no particular order, you start to talk about like cellular health, cellular adaptation, mitochondrial density, blood vessel creation and angiogenesis, arterial elasticity, cardiac output, stroke volume, like all of these, like from cellular to, larger organ, function and adaptation can all happening when you're doing your cardiovascular exercise. However, oftentimes we aren't necessarily asking the right certain questions about our cardiovascular programming that we are about going to the gym and about certain benefits, strength wise, muscle wise, et cetera, that we would ask of our program, that were a resistance training program essentially.
Right.
And that's kind of what we talked a little bit about before, is that are people targeting, like, how are you using, like you said, how are you using your cardio?
Yeah.
Do you target it to just like burn out some energy? Are you using heart rate based data to train in certain zones? Are you kind of doing a spectrum of cardiovascular training to hit different energy systems? Do you have an event, or are you focused on a very specific goal with your cardio by performing in that event or sport? So that's kind of, from a coach's perspective, that's what we think of when we think of cardiovascular exercise and improving overall performance and health. And we just want our listeners and followers to start to maybe open up that thinking box a bit about how you're using your cardio, and are you using it to the best of your benefit, depending on really what you want to be better at.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a great point to like actually start thinking about it, because I think that there's a lot of people that think, oh, I'm going to go to the gym today and that's my fitness, right? Like I've done my thing. And that's why it's like for me, for example, like with my clients, like that's why I give a step count as well as resistance training. Now, there's obviously aesthetic reasons for that. Like I know you like in metabolic adaptation, like we do need to kind of get energy out to get a certain result. So steps is a way to get energy out, but also the cardiovascular benefits of walking at a brisk pace are
Mhm.
amazing. Like that's how simple it is. And that's why it's like, consistency in that kind of cardiovascular is something as simple as walking can really benefit you long term. Like I plan to walk for the rest of my life. Like, like that would be great. Um, but I think that people just assume like, oh, if I look good, I don't have any heart problems, like I'll take my dad, for example, like fittest guy I know, and has had some heart issues because number one, it runs in the family genetically. Number two, it's just like that's what happens when you get old. And it's like you don't think it's going to happen to you until it actually happens. So, yeah, secondary heart block from just sleep apnea. He's not the typical patient for sleep apnea, that it's like, it's kind of wild that that can really happen. So, it's something to talk about. It's something important. And obviously, both of us being like interested in like, the body composition side of things, I think that it was really interesting for us to really dive into like the evidence around like the cardiovascular training versus resistance training and how that can actually impact your heart health, right?
Mhm.
So, obviously, for fat loss, like we know that the research out there is like fat loss depends on energy deficit only, independent of the method for weight loss, which, like I always say, it's a law. Calorie deficit or energy deficit, you can say, is a law. Now, you cannot out train or outwork or out calorie burn like a massive calorie surplus, right? A lot of people try. I've tried in the past with zero success. Um, but obviously, now when you think of just someone going into a calorie deficit and they're doing a bunch of running, obviously their cardiovascular system is going to improve, right? Someone is going on consistent runs. Like I've seen that. I trained for a half marathon once. I'll never do it again. But man, I was like flying. Like I felt on top of the world. Like I could run up hills and stuff. Like it was great. And you do notice that change even at a younger age. Like you don't have to be old to notice those changes. But I also think that, what the research is showing is that there actually is cardiovascular benefits for having muscle mass. They did this study where they had 4 groups of different people, and obviously there's gender differences too, but they had people with like low muscle mass and low fat mass, or low muscle mass and high fat mass, and then also groups with high muscle mass, low fat mass, and high muscle mass and high fat mass. And the group that had the lowest cardiovascular mortality was the one with the high muscle mass and low fat mass, which would make sense because low fat mass, you think, oh, well, they have less body fat. Obviously, that's going to like be helpful with their cholesterol and their whatever, their heart health. But actually, it was the high muscle mass and high fat mass that also was a really important, like that was also reduced cardiovascular mortality more than the groups with the low muscle mass. Like, that's just cool.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I saw that when and we discussed a little bit about that. I mean, there's something about, obviously, I'm not sure if they really understand the mechanism of that. However, it's so important of a take home message that, the kind of the composition of the body in terms of fat mass to lean mass, like is somehow conveying, a benefit cardiovascularly in the system, even if you happen to have a little bit of a slightly higher fat mass as well. So, I mean, for me, that's such a huge point to kind of drill home for the importance of, lean mass preservation and lean mass building, regardless of your particular goals, and in the instance of just healthy aging and like performance aging, I like to call it. So yeah, I love it. I mean, looks like a great study. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, there's also gender differences too. So they found that the women with the high muscle mass and high fat mass actually had a lower cardiovascular mortality risk than the men with the high muscle mass and high fat mass. And I'm thinking that's a survival thing because women in general just have higher body fat percentage. So I because we give childbirth, we have like a lot more tissue, like more fat tissue. And I think that comes down to like like an evolution thing. Like we should have lower cardiovascular risk with a higher body fat percentage. Like that just makes sense to me, right?
Yeah, I can get behind that.
Yeah. I mean, like,
Yeah.
look, don't quote me on that. But I mean, like that was what was found in the study. But I think like when I think about it evolutionary, I'm like,
Yeah.
well, women we have more fat anyways. So yeah, I think that, when we're thinking about cardiovascular health, so many people are like, okay, well, how would I go about improving that then? Like if someone's listening to this and they're like, well, like I just go to the gym 1 hour, maybe every day or 5 days a week. And they're not doing any kind of walking. They're not doing any kind of cardio. It's like, I know that you were talking before about how like, it's like switching up the type of cardiovascular work that you're doing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can expand a little bit on that as well. I think to your point, there are different, like very specific cardiovascular in terms of the actual, let's say, adaptation of the heart itself to different types of cardiovascular exercise and different intensities.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about, low to moderate intensity, you'll generally find, increased efficiency in heart function based on stroke volume, but it's actually some of it. Sometimes it's the periods of moderate to higher intensity that's balanced, that actually like stretches the heart so it actually adapts to pump stronger and have a higher efficiency of blood ejection.
That makes perfect sense. I think too, maybe people don't understand, like the more your heart like expands and shoots blood out, like you want that. You don't want it to be sluggish, right?
Exactly. So often we call it, it's essentially a stretch response adaptation to the stress of exercise, right? So if you're constantly moving at like, there's certainly benefits to the walking and to the low intensity, right? So we get a lot of cellular adaptation. We get, just some of the benefits of that. But if you go up the scale of intensities at the right amounts and at the right times, you're essentially training your heart like it would any other muscle, with, just having it gain strength and sometimes gaining in size as well.
Mm-hmm.
However, that can be a little bit of a different conversation in terms of the types of heart muscle hypertrophy that we're looking for. So without getting too nerdy and too off track, you want that stretch adaptation, the heart to get stronger as a result of the training. And that happens at certain intensities more so than others.
Right. Right. And I think like too, like if we talk purely heart health, like if someone wanted to like, okay, like I need to improve my heart health like ASAP, yes, resistance training can kind of like indirectly impact, right? Like there's a lot of research on like resistance training and how it's like it could elevate blood flow for short periods of time and like under like higher pressure, and like that can be more of like a stress stimulus for your heart in a good way. And obviously arterial remodeling. So basically your arteries being able to, like you said, like that stretch effect without change in dilatory capacity. I mean, lots of fancy science words here, but obviously, that is going to have a benefit on your cardiovascular system. But if we're talking like straight cardiovascular, like, hey, how am I going to improve my cardiovascular? You are looking at those more endurance activities, like, and whether it's high intensity interval training, running hills, like running long distances, walking long distances, that is going to benefit you more in your cardiovascular, like long term, than just going to the gym for 1 hour per day and lifting weights, right?
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
Even for like the walking. So there was a cool study that I found that was like clinically meaningful improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness were observed in participants who walked a minimum of only 60 minutes per week at a fast pace. And the other group was a group of people who only walked 60 minutes per week at a leisurely pace. And there was not the same benefits. So it actually matters. Like you've got to go out if you're going to just walk, brisk walk.
Right. Right. Walk with a purpose. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and that does go back to a little bit of the point we talked about before, like the purposeful exercise, purposeful movement.
Mhm.
And that's, obviously if you are not using that time to, as part of your kind of fitness routine with the walking, um, it's okay to take a nice leisurely walk every now and then. But if you're using it for your fitness, just be sure to step it up a notch,
Yeah.
and try not to take it too leisurely just to get those benefits as well.
Yeah.
So I like that. That's important to know for sure.
And I think too, like if probably now people like if you're listening to this, if you're watching this, if you're listening to this, you might be thinking like, well, now what? I have to like, everyone's busy. Like everyone is
Yeah.
scheduling, right? Like, well, how am I supposed to do that and lift weights and do these things? And that's why like I think Gordon and I are like we're both on the same page in terms of like the minimum effective dose in terms of like, okay, you don't have to go to the gym every single day to improve your cardiovascular health or improve your muscle mass. Like you were talking about like the highest yield for
Mhm.
what you're wanting to be doing. And I think that's an important point. Like I don't want people to go and think they have to go run miles and miles or do a bunch of HIIT classes. Like if I have a client that says, oh, can I do a HIIT class? I'm like, yeah, like that's fun. Like that's good for you, but don't go overboard on it, right?
Agreed.
We could dive into heart health supplements.
We have a couple on the list here that tend to come up a lot in the media, on social media, and in blogs, etc., but also even in the clinic and prescribing or recommending for certain uses and certain indications. So as it relates to specifically to heart health, and when we talk about heart health, we just have to clarify what that means. In the research, what we're generally looking at when we look at these studies, for the relationship between, let's say, a supplement or a diet or a food to cardiovascular disease, we're looking at a few things: primary prevention of of cardiovascular events and mortality. So those are things like stroke, myocardial infarction, and mortality risk.
Mhm.
And then in addition, we're also looking at additional clinical endpoints that are generally considered risk factors, like almost like secondary or additional risk factors for cardiovascular disease, right? So if we were going to go through like the primary risk factors, we would talk about, age, genetics, obesity, diabetes, alcohol and illicit drug use, age, smoking, the list goes on. Secondary could be, maybe a little bit more lifestyle kind of influenced, things from diet and lifestyle, blood pressure, blood glucose, lipid profile. And some of these are also genetically influenced as well. Lipid profile, inflammatory status, or other inflammatory conditions, or comorbidities, sleep apnea, stress. Like the list once again like goes on and on, because so many things affect your cardiovascular system and risk for cardiovascular disease in general. So just to kind of get that out of the way, we're generally looking at those markers as indicators for risk for cardiovascular disease. So with that said, which ones should we tackle?
I think that olive oil, because I actually think that when I learned this and when we were in school, I was like, what? Like I obviously knew like olive oil is good for you, but the impact on like actually what it can do for like some of those markers that you were talking about, like those inflammatory markers and the blood pressure, like I think that's just the coolest thing. Like olive oil,
Mhm.
everyone has olive oil in their home.
Yeah.
And I think so many people think like, oh, olive oil, like that's fat. Fat is going to clog my arteries and it's going to give me, I don't know how to say this word, atherosclerosis. But like, yeah, and it's just like so not true. So I know that you really dove into this one and you found like a good systematic review and meta-analysis actually that talks about that.
Yeah, I did. I think this one in particular was actually, it wasn't comparison. So sometimes the challenge with some of these kind of foods and supplements is if they're actually kind of studying randomized control trials, or if they're like cohort studies, which kind of just are observing populations in a kind of prospective manner. So that being said, one of the other things that often goes along with the olive oil discussion is the Mediterranean diet. So they kind of go hand in hand. But there are separate studies that are just address the olive oil itself, in an attempt to test just the theory of the benefit of the olive oil itself. However, so yeah, I did find a study from 2019 that suggested, and this is interesting. This is kind of a new concept for me as well. The concept of high polyphenol versus low polyphenol olive oil. And honestly, I've never really heard that before.
Yeah.
Polyphenol is essentially just a compound found in these generally plant foods, and it's been linked to cardiovascular kind of disease risk. Polyphenols in general. Other examples that you might know could be like resveratrol, and there's many others. But for example,
right,
there's a specific compound in olive oil that they're finding to be indicated. Anyway, long story short, it's been found to improve levels of total cholesterol, HDL, and benefit inflammatory markers like CRP, and also in benefit for blood pressure.
Yeah, that's cool.
So
blood pressure, like you had said before, like blood pressure is like really sensitive, right? Like your blood pressure is like, that's going to determine a lot. And I know some naturopathic doctors even recommend like taking like whole tablespoons of olive oil, like not just using it to cook, but like literally taking it in its raw form. And that's pretty much in everyone's kitchen. And I think the polyphenol thing comes down to the quality. Like,
yeah,
I mean, there's polyphenols in like wine. Am I wrong?
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. That was the resveratrol, is the most well-known one. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's actually really interesting that like even using like drizzling olive oil like on your food after it's been cooked, even like that can be like a really big benefit, like in its raw form. So yeah, olive oil. Like I think that, to me, I'm like, that is just the coolest thing. Maybe we're just nerds, Gordon.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely that in some ways. And so kind of it's hard to necessarily suggest that there's a take home. And of course, this isn't meant to be kind of, medical advice or recommending anything particular in terms of to our listeners, in terms of adding this right away to your situation. Of course, please seek discussion with your physician or with a naturopathic doctor or someone who can help you with some of these decisions.
Good catch. We're not giving anyone medical advice, guys.
Yeah, this is not meant to be. Yeah, so just kind of trying to review the data so that you can at least have a little bit of a better perspective on some of these things that you can look into further. So just moving on to the Mediterranean diet, and of course this gets huge buzz. I mean, the number of studies in the research on the Mediterranean diet and all sorts of conditions, diseases, risk factors, et cetera, it's just huge. And I found a very recent 2019 meta-analysis that looked at 30 randomized controlled trials, which is a pretty large number. What did they come home with? Take-home message. A lot of people are discussing the Mediterranean diet for the heart health and the cholesterol lowering, triglyceride lowering, et cetera. So what they found, interestingly enough, is that there's low to moderate quality of evidence for a reduction in the systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure, and very low to low quality evidence of no reduction in LDL cholesterol, total cholesterol, or triglycerides. Now, it seems a little bit counter to the overarching message in the media, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. And I think like it is frustrating when you hear something or like you think something and then you go actually to look into the research and you're just like, well, you want it. You're like, I'm rooting for the Mediterranean diet, right? Like I would say, like I pretty much eat the Mediterranean diet. I would say I don't eat like, so if someone doesn't know what the Mediterranean diet is, we'll tell you. Basically, like you're looking at fish, seafood, like chicken, like poultry, eggs, dairy. Well, I don't even know if dairy is part of the Mediterranean diet. I think in like sparingly, but it's basically like fresh fruits and vegetables, legume, nuts, like lots of good fatty fish with the omegas, and like red meats pretty like sparingly or not at all, right? If it's a strict Mediterranean diet. So like, hey, huge fan of the Mediterranean diet. I don't eat that much fish. I should. But yeah, like I'm rooting for it. And obviously like we know that like your diet is going to be an important part of your overall health. Then when you look at the research, it's like, damn, like I'm rooting for it. And it sucks that it's like the research, you're like, damn it.
Agreed. And I think it always has to be taken with, any evidence has to be taken with caution, of course. And so this is one study, but this study looked at 30 other studies. And so you kind of start to get a picture of, okay, so, what is it missing? What were some of the limitations? Maybe it doesn't apply to certain, maybe it was a certain population that they were all looking at, et cetera, et cetera. So certainly I'm also a big fan of many of the benefits and approaches of the Mediterranean diet. And I think a large swath of evidence will show that it's overall extremely healthy of a lifestyle and of a behavior pattern for people to be living. If you have access to it, of course. And so we do generally, that's almost like one of those things that we generally do take as fact. However, there's still so many things that remain unclear as the evidence is just always changing, and there's so much research. So I think those were two, nutrients or two kind of approaches to discuss, which kind of overlap, of course. Actually, sorry, three: olive oil, fish oil. The fish oil and the Mediterranean
we didn't really
diet.
talk about fish oil, although
right.
another supplement I'm rooting for that just repeatedly lets me down in the research, whether it's for, I know I was telling you, I did like the research on like anxiety and how like mental health can be impacted by taking fish oils. And I'm in there, I'm on PubMed, I'm typing away. I'm like, this is going to be awesome. No research, like the shittiest research, like inconclusive. Like, you know what the best thing for anxiety was? Breathing techniques. You know what I mean? Again, working the cardiovascular system, working the lungs, like it's an important part, right? We obviously veering a little bit off track, but fish oils, again, it's the jury's out. The jury's out.
Yeah, we want to root so hard for it. And we do see it used for so many different things, especially in the clinic, from the clinical side. And when we're doing this research, it's always like, well, it's sometimes it's tough to really come up with overwhelming consensus. However, we do certainly root for some of these. And it's just interesting to always do your best to find reliable resources and reliable people to listen to, and resources to look at where this evidence and where the information is coming from on specific concerns. And of course, this has been mostly and pretty much all about cardiovascular health and cardiovascular risk factors. But if it's fish oil for something else, be sure to do your diligence and find some reliable information on that as well.
Yeah. And like, Gordon, do you take fish oil?
I do.
So do I. Because I know that there are like inflammatory markers. For example, like I know that is some research out there, like on blood work, like that it does come back. Obviously, like I'm trying to reduce inflammation. Like that's my goal. Like I want to be less inflamed, so my brain and my heart can all work better. So, it's hard because it's like, okay, you have to know what you're researching, right? And that's the problem with like kind of fads that are out there when people take these like one single statements and they're like, fish oil is the cure all for everything. And it's like, well, like, what is it the cure for? What are you testing? Right. And there's a difference between like the mechanism of action and actually what the result is in a live human study, right? Someone could do test tubes all day and say, oh, well, this and this and this. And it's like, no, how is it actually impacting the human body? Because that's what matters most for mortality and morbidity.
1,000%. Wow, you said, that's such a good point, because mechanistically it just can't be necessarily blanketed across or even if it makes sense kind of mechanistically and theoretically, or even biochemically,
Right.
taking something, right, if the kind of the biochemical pathway is this leads to this leads to this leads to this, it still doesn't mean that it's going to work if you take one of the things in the middle and try to, affect that pathway. So it just doesn't work that way all the time, and we need to,
Yeah.
be aware that there's a high likelihood that it doesn't at
Right.
all work that way,
Exactly.
right?
And I like how you said all the time, because there are some things that like mechanistically, is that a word? Mechanistically.
It sure is.
That's great, great news. That it does, like you can actually follow the mechanism, right? Like for example, like the mechanism of how atherosclerosis occurs by
Mhm.
like, you know what I mean? Like that is a mechanism that is, that is tried and true. Like they've seen it happen. So like overall, I think like the take home point, if we can even, unless there's another, like unless there's another supplement, but we don't want to make this too long. Um, but I think the take home point is like, it's not just about the one thing that you do. Like, if your diet is really shitty and you go on a walk, a 60-minute walk per week and expecting, maybe you might see some improvement in your cardiovascular health, but like you have to look at the whole picture. Like, again, the foundations, like, what is your lifestyle like? Um,
Mhm.
I think that's the most important part when you're looking at, cardiovascular health of like, doesn't mean you can't have the fun foods that we all like to enjoy, but just be aware that like
Mhm.
moderation is going to be your friend here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and just to kind of summarize a bit, I mean, we talked a little bit about from the exercise perspective, the targeting your cardiovascular exercise. We talked about some of the benefits of resistance training, separate from and alongside the cardiovascular training. We talked about um, some of the supplements that are common and some of the data there, but there's also just general recommendations for heart health too. Of course, like eating tons of vegetables, like the rainbow plates, and like we hear about, right? And um, varied sources of high quality protein. Like fiber is another good one that we did not touch on. There's quite a bit of data on fiber, trying to get just plenty of fiber. Um, and just things, really basic things like hydration and sleep and stress reduction. Of course, we kind of sometimes take some of that stuff for granted, but like I said, so many things about the cardiovascular health and the system are affected by essentially everything, and it's really some aspects of it are very sensitive, and some of them take years and years and years to develop. So, yeah, just keeping that kind of spectrum and that timeline in line when you're creating your programs and when you're looking at your general nutrition. I think it's just important to think about the overarching big picture as well as some of the details with your lifestyle.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, the stress reduction practice is actually crazy how like increase of cardiovascular like risk comes from someone who just lives a super stressed out life. Like I always tell people, like I think I lost years off my life from medical school. Like I swear, like the amount of stress that I was under like first and second year. But it's true. Like you do notice the difference. So that is something I think that's a little bit undervalued. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, did you have anything else you wanted to touch on?
No, I think that was honestly, that was good. Nailed
Well,
it.
I hope so. I hope the listeners out there enjoyed it. We did bounce around a little bit. Hope the message was mostly clear, and in the spirit of heart health, cardiovascular kind of awareness month, and heart health awareness month, um, just take those extra moments to think about how you're, taking care of your heart and your cardiovascular health. And if you need help, with and guidance with, find someone who can advise you. And certainly a couple of those people, but there are many out there, and
Yeah,
we'd certainly be happy to answer your questions, any and all. And so don't hesitate to reach out.
yeah, that was really well said. Great. Heart Health Awareness Month. Love to see it. And thanks for listening, guys.
Thanks, everyone.